Love. What comes to mind when you hear the word love? Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter thought he knew love. We hear, love our enemy, love our neighbor, don't love the world, love God. Do we know love? The world tells us how to love, but Jesus teaches us what real love is.
Continue in our series of Love Rated R, and I've really been enjoying teaching out of this series because I felt like in many ways God has given me great opportunities to love. How many have had great opportunities to love this week with Thanksgiving, right? So when I say that, what I mean by that is that God often gives us opportunities because it's someone that we had to have God's love to love someone. And so it seems maybe it was a family member, maybe it was a friend, maybe it was someone that was near to you, but yet still I seem this series has awakened an opportunity to love someone, even maybe if they've hurt you or if they've offended you. I was talking with a friend of mine, and he was telling me, we were talking about church planning and growing churches, and how small groups have started and kind of come down, and he said, the number one reason, Gilbert, that churches struggle when it comes to small groups or to really building familia or intimacy is unresolved conflict. It's unresolved conflict. In other words, there are things that it's easier for us to just say, I'm not going to be part of anymore, than to enter that space and speak truth and love and let God bring healing and wholeness to that situation. How many know what I'm talking about? That it's easy many a times when you have struggles with somebody to just step away and say, hey, I'm just not going to talk to them anymore. I'm just not going to speak to them anymore. I'm just not going to engage with them anymore. But yet over and over again, we can look at maybe the trajectory of our lives. We can look at different things that have happened in our lives, and we look at what's happened to us, and we probably can look at several people that in our history of our lives, we've decided I'm just not going to talk to them anymore. And that doesn't change when we become believers. In fact, I think many times when we become believers, we even have religious reasons why we won't talk to people. Isn't that so nice? Right? Like, I don't want to mix with the world. Right? I don't want to be with people who are toxic for me. I don't want to be with people who don't, and yet when I look at the scripture, I look at Jesus often spending time with people who are toxic. I see Jesus often spending time with people who don't reach the religious goals of people around them, but yet he engaged a relationship with them because he was the epitome of love. You see, when we say we're going to be followers of Jesus, whenever we say those words, I'm a Christian, which means Christian, right? Christian simply means I am Christ-like, I'm seeking to follow Jesus. And when I make that decision and I make that declaration, it carries weight with it, guys. All of a sudden, now we move from this place of we just simply go to church or attend religious activities to now we decide we are going to be like Christ in nature, character, and life here on this earth. So we're going to continue in 1 John chapter 4, we're all through the end of the year, we'll be in 1 John chapter 4 today, verse 9 through 11. Today we will hope to learn how God's love is both for us, but also through us, always in action. So verse 9 says, this is how God's love showed his love among us. And in that scripture, if you notice, I put, this is how God, parentheses, love, because we learned last week that God is love. So throughout today's sermon, you're going to hear me use the word love in substitution of the word God. Because I want us to get to the clarity that God isn't kind of like love, God isn't sort of like love, God is love. Right? And that love is not defined by what we think love is, but that love is defined by God because God is love. So this process that God is calling us into this here, this is how love showed his love among us, right? So we learned last week that love is an action word, right? How many remember when you were a kid? How many like action figures when you were a kid? Right? There's some of you, hallelujah, you're praising. At first time I saw Don raise his hand all year, right? But action figures, some of us loved action figures. I remember, I'm going to date myself, but my action figures, the first ones were Star Wars, right? I used to have Star Wars action figures, right? And because what was the thing about action figures is that you were able to, through that action figure, you were able to make it move and talk and move action. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but before action figures, that's all you had was stationary figures. Now, for those remember back in the day, right? They used to have those green army guys. Now, for those who don't remember that, if you saw Toy Story, that's how the Toy Story starts, with the green army guys. You notice the guys can't move. And in fact, their legs are straight, and in the movie, they just do this, right? Because there's no action in it. They're just stationary. But when action figures came into back in the 1950s and 60s, it revolutionized kids' ability to do actions. And I don't know if you remember, they even had one that was like the $1 million man. And remember that one? I'm really dating myself, right? I remember the $1 million man because the thing about it is that in his head, he had like X-ray, he had this vision where he could just see far and see things. So in the action figure, it had a hole in the back of his head. You could see through his eye, right? And it gave you this supernatural way to look at that. Now, why am I talking about action figures this morning? Because love is an action. It moves us to do something. And what action figures just simply did is it created a way to move all this energy and thought and things in our head into action, and they could become something that we were not. But through this action, we could become superheroes. We could become something that we want. And that's why it awakened many young men's and young women's minds to this thought, because love is an action word. Listen to this. 1 John 3:18 says, "Dear friends, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions in truth." Man, that's a powerful word. Right? I'm going to read that one more time. Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. See, because people talk all the time, "Hey, I love you, bro." You know how you know you love somebody? When it's 3 a.m, you call them and they go pick you up because you got a flat tire. That's how you know you love somebody. You can't say anything else, just say ouch, right? Because see, love is really easy to talk about how you love somebody, right? But it's when do you see love is when it's in action. When you're sick and your mom takes care of you. When you're going through a tough time and a friend shows up, even though it's your 3rd breakup and the guy told you don't go with that girl. You know she ain't good for you. Like, all right, that's how you know it's love, right? How do you know it's love? When you've gone through the same thing over and over and someone just puts their arm and says, "Hey, dude, it's going to be okay." Even though you know it's going to hurt for a long time. That's where love takes action. See, that's why Jesus didn't just say, he didn't just from heaven start shouting, "I love you." He didn't just send letters and say, "I love you." What did he do? He sent his son. Listen to this. In Matthew 1:23 says, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel." Look what Emmanuel means for God with us. Remember we talked about last couple of weeks that God's desire from the beginning of time is to be with us. That in the book of Genesis, it talks about that God walked in the cool of the day with man because his whole desire for man is to be with us, to be near us, to spend time with us. And that being with us, what it did is it awakened in our hearts something that only God can do. And every time we lose that, we look for it in other places. We look for it in sex. We look for it in drugs. We look for it in partying. We look for it in all these other things because God created us to have those walks where we spend time with God and he talks to us and gives us what only he can give us. And he knows that without him, our destiny is destruction and killing ourselves with everything everything that gets in front of us because we're still trying to feel the very thing he wanted us and created us to do was to walk and talk with him. And so when Jesus comes to redeem that, what was lost in the garden and with Eve and with Adam, now when he sends his son in action, he says, I want to come and live among you. I want to come and live among you. Because when he comes and lives among us, what he's doing is, what he's saying is like, look, like God himself is saying, because I'm a holy God, I'm a pure God, I can't physically go with you, so I'm going to send you my son, who is a reflection of who I am, so that you can see my love in my son, in and through you. That's important. Now, I've entitled today's message, Show and Tell. Because God always doesn't just talk about stuff, but it's show and tell. How many remember show and tell when you were in school? Anybody remember that? Right? Sometimes they'd bring stuff up and I'm like, dude, that's whack, dude. I don't know why that kid brought that. He's got like a dog and his ears all broken, and you know, you got an action figure and he doesn't have the parts anymore. They're all missing. Didn't matter. That kid, when you were show and tell and you brought your thing, I don't care what it was, you loved it, right? Like, it could have been anything, but if it was important to you, that's what you brought because you wanted to show and tell that. Can I tell you that when Jesus came to earth, when God came to earth through his son Jesus, it was his show and tell. Hey, let me show you. Let me just not tell you, but let me show you my love. Now, I brought two gloves today, or I bought a pair of gloves today, because I think it was a great way for me to kind of understand. So when you look at a pair of gloves, right, you don't look at gloves simply as an individual glove. In fact, when you look at one individual glove, it kind of feels like I don't have gloves anymore, right? Anybody feel that way? Like when you have, like how many have ever found gloves and you found one? I'm the only one. Okay, so I found gloves, and often I found one, and I'm like, darn it, I don't have gloves to wear, because nobody's going to wear one glove out all day unless you're Michael Jackson, right? If you're the king of pop, you can do whatever you want. But if you're not, then most of us don't wear a glove out of it. But what we do is actually we have two pairs of gloves, but there's still one. It's two gloves, but it's one pair. Can I tell you that's the way God and the Father are? They're two separate gloves, but it's one pair. So remember in the Bible it says this, that when you see the Father, you see, Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father. They look the same. They're the same. There's still one. It's one pair. So when God sent his son into the earth, he wasn't just saying, hey, I'm gonna send you my son, and he's gonna be no. He was saying this. He was saying, look, when you see the son, you're seeing the Father. When you see that's why Jesus, when he's on earth, he says, hey, I don't say anything that I don't see my Father, I don't hear my Father say. I don't do anything unless I see my Father do it. It is this conjunction between between Jesus and the Son and the Father that connects us and pulls us into this place that reminds us that, hey, every time I'm with Jesus, I'm actually with the Father. The two are one. When I see one, I see the other. When I see Jesus dying on the cross, you see, we think sometimes Jesus just died on the cross, and that was a tough thing. That was so hard that God sent. No. I need you to understand that when Jesus is on the cross, the Father was on the cross with him. When Jesus was on earth healing and touching people, it wasn't just Jesus touching people. It was the Father touching people. It wasn't just Jesus' love. And how do we know this? Remember when he's in Gethsemane. He's about to go to the cross. He's about to lay down his life. What does Jesus say at that moment? He's already ministered for 3 years. He knows he was born for this moment. And then he gets to that point where he's about to lay down and he says, God, not my will, but thy will be done. The ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate show of love. You see, without that sacrifice, we wouldn't have anything else we're talking about. Without that sacrifice that the Father was saying, hey, I'm asking you to lay down everything because this is how I love to this depth. And no one will understand this love. No one will understand the love of the Father unless this happens. This is why Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 35 through 6, shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger, as it is written, what shall separate us from the love of Christ? For our sake we are considered as sheep to the slaughter every single day. So this thought of what shall separate us from the love of Christ is this thought of saying, look, that the depth and the breadth of God's love could only be seen through the Son. Now, this is important because when we start looking at it, it almost seems like we try and always separate. Well, that's the Son, that's the Father. No. They're one. They operate as one. Just like it's two pair. It's like one pair, but they're still operating together. I've shared this story before, but I thought it'd be good to share again today. So if you've heard it, please indulge me for a moment. But there's a story about a man who was extremely wealthy. He had acquired a lot of art during his lifetime. In fact, he was considered perhaps to be the most prolific art collector of his lifetime. He had Monets, he had Picassos, he had everything that you can think of, and he had them all in this mansion. And one day he comes to his death. And they gather all the greatest art collectors, and they all are waiting for his auction of everything that he has. So they finally set the date. People fly from all over the world, and they come to his mansion. And they sit in this great room that fills over 100 people are sitting there, and they're waiting. And they start off the auction, and they say, okay, we're going to start this, and we're going to auction off all his greatest pieces. Now, this collection had been literally over 50 years he had been collecting, and he has some of the best pieces. People have been waiting their whole life to get these pieces, and they bring up the first piece of art and they put it on the easel. And it's a picture of his son. And it's a picture of his son. And it wasn't even a very good picture. It was a picture that he had drawn. Always being the art aficionado, always being the best. He had driven, and it didn't look quite as nice as perhaps one of the Monets or some of the other ones, but it was still the one that he, the Father, had hand drawn of the Son. They start the auction and they say, hey, who will start the opening bid and start this off, this great auction? And much like this, it's just silent. Nobody's bidding. They're like, hey, let's get to the good stuff. Why are we bidding off this picture of your son? Stay silent. He says, we will not commence the auction until the son. And in fact, many of the art collectors are offended by this very fact because they're saying, we've come for good art, not for a picture of your son. Then in the back of the room, there's this gentleman that's been cleaning this same house and has helped seeing the sun be raised and has been getting ready so the auction could happen. And he starts seeing that no one is bidding on the picture of the sun. And him having affinity for the sun, having seen the sun been raised and having been killed off in war, he comes back and he says, I'll do $5 for the sun. The auctioneer says, is there anyone else? Everyone was pretty indignant still from the whole challenge of having to listen to this man talk about the son. Says, no one else. Stays quiet. He says, all right, going once, going twice, going 3 times, sold. $5 to the man in the back. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight, and I appreciate that you've come from all over the world, but the auction is now concluded. Well, the room erupts and says, well, what do you mean? We've been waiting for this art. What do you mean it's concluded? He says, the gentleman, before he passed, he said this. He says that whoever takes the son gets it all. Whoever takes the son gets it all. And from that moment on, every art piece, every Monet, every Picasso, every statue that he had bought over 50 years, collecting multi-millions of dollars, was all gotten in one moment by a man who's bid $5 because he understood the value of the sun, while the others only saw the creation, but not the sun. Can I tell you that that's when we get when we get the sun? We don't get just his creation. We get everything with him. And I think there's so many times when we think of when we're interacting with God that like somehow God isn't enough, how God isn't just enough. But listen to this, and it says that he sent his son, his only begotten son, into the world that we may live through him. That God sent his very best for us. He sent his only begotten son. He sent his very best for us. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life." You know that God's desire for us is that we'd have everlasting life, not just get through life. I love this next scripture in Galatians 2:20 says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in my body, I live by the faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." I want to notice this. The life I now live in my body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. In other words, I don't live through myself anymore. Now I live through the Son of God. So when now I come into Jesus, you see, these hands, I can do a lot with these hands. I can help people. I can touch people. I can encourage people. I can lift things. I can move things. But these hands in a moment will have a transformation the moment I put these gloves on. The moment I put these gloves on, you can no longer tell anymore if these hands are black hands, they're white hands, they're yellow hands, that you can't tell anymore. Because from this point on, once you put those gloves on, now no longer do you see this, but you are seeing it through, you are seeing my hands through these gloves. And that's why when God calls us to walk and to live now in him, he's saying, hey, I don't want you to live your life just through your own power, your own strength, your own ability. I'm calling you to live through the power and the love that is in the Son whom I sent for you. You see, God's love is what gives us the power and the love to do the things that you and I can no longer do. In my own hands, I can't touch dry ice. I have gloves on, I can now touch dry ice. In my hands, I can't get to something that's hot or something, but when you have gloves on, you can get to stuff that's hot. There are things that you cannot do in your own flesh that only through the Son that you and I can do. There are things God calls you to, people he's calling you to forgive, people he's calling you to love, people he's calling us to restore, people he's calling, there's things in your spirit that God put dreams in your life. He put visions about what he called you to do, and you can't see them from where you are because you're doing it in your flesh. But the moment you say, I no longer live in my flesh, but now I live through Christ, guess what? That supernatural power of the King comes in and through us from that point on. This is what he calls us to. This through Christ. I no longer, again, I'm going to read it one more because his word is good. I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I no longer live. I no longer live. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This is when love becomes real, guys. I no longer live. There's so many things in my life that I feel are impossible when I read Scripture sometimes. God, how am I supposed to forgive those who hurt me? God, how am I supposed to turn the other cheek? God, how am I supposed to love people who have offended me? And in my flesh, in my own desire, my desire is to make a fist. But in Jesus, he is saying, open your hand. Help him up. In my desire, in my flesh, I'm like, God, I failed you and I've hurt you and I've fallen to pieces and I can't. And in him, he's like, pick up your hand and let me carry you. Grab on a hold of me. Even to grab on a hold of God, I need God's help. It's in this process that we are more than conquerors. Listen to this. Because when we start living through Jesus, now in all these things, Romans 8:37 says, now in all these things, we are more than conquerors. What? Through him who loved us. Through him. Through him. It's not in my strength. It's not in my flesh. This will fail me. My flesh will fail me. My desires, my own carnal, broken, stinking flesh will always lead me to death and sin. But when I am in Jesus, when I am in the Father, then it says, we are more than conquerors through him who what? Who loved us. You can do the things that you think you cannot do when it is through him, not for him. Listen to that, guys. It is through him, not for him. And many of us, we've lived our lives, I want to do this for God. I want to be better for God. And God is saying, stop trying to do things for me. You don't have the strength. You don't have the power. But through me, you can do anything. Listen to this. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who gives me, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. I can do all things. What is impossible for God? I want you to think about this. What would you do if you could not fail? What would you do if you could not fail? How would we live different if we understood and lived knowing that we could not fail? Why? Because it didn't say some things. It didn't say sometimes. It says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Through him again. Through him again. Not in my own strength. His strength. Why? Because when I see the Father, I see the Son. When I get the Father's love, I have the Father's Son, the Son's love. I want to wrap up with this. Number 3 is love was sent as an atoning sacrifice. This is love. Not that we loved God, not that we loved love, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for us. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And listen to this. I love Romans 5. It says, but God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While you and I were still in our mess, still in our brokenness, still in our emptiness. Isn't that beautiful? Think about that. Christ died for us. While we were still broken and hurt, he died for us. I don't know about you, but I have a tendency to forget that. I have a tendency to become very religious and act like somehow my poop don't stink. I'm just going to say it. Anybody else there with me? Well, we get, and we're like, we've been in church, and they know better, and they should have done it, and I've been using this, we should all over one another. You should have done this, and you should have done that, and you should have done this, and you should have done that. And Jesus is saying, no, you're here but by the grace of me. You're here because while you were still a sinner, while you were still far off, while you were still seeking after your own desires, I still died for you. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son as a ransom. The son that when we get him, we get it all. He sent it while we were still in the mess of our sin. Why? I'm going to read 1 John 2:2. This love is an atoning sacrifice out of the Amplified. So it's a little bit different. I'm going to wrap up with this. It says this. Listen, just pay attention to this. And he, that same Jesus, is the propitiation of our sin. That word propitiation is the atoning sacrifice that holds back the wrath of God that we would otherwise be directed at us because of our sinful nature, our worldliness, and our lifestyle. But not for ours alone, but also for the sin of believers throughout the whole world. So this atoning sacrifice, once again, the Father and the Son working together to say, I'm going to hold back. I'm going to hold back the sin. I'm going to hold back the consequence of sin, which is death, hell, and the grave. I'm going to stand in the midst and hold back. I'm going to hold back that you should have died that day. I'm going to hold back that you should have OD'd that day. I'm going to hold back that that bullet should have hit you that day. I'm going to hold back all the things that you should be disqualified from being in my kingdom today. I'm going to hold back sin, death, and your husband leaving you, and your wife leaving you, and your parents finding out who you are. And I'm going to hold back all of that. And then I'm going to reach out so that others can come into the hope that is in glory. That's what means the perpetuation, that he is our perpetuation of our sin. He holds back and he reaches out. He holds back all the things you and I should have lived in, should have taken the consequence for, should have been died for, should have been embarrassed for. He holds all of that back. Then he turns. He says, is there anyone else? Is there anyone else that needs this love? Is there anyone else that wants to come because I'm a father who's looking for his children? Is there anyone else that says, come on? And you know what he's using? He's using us. He's using us to hold back. Because see what he did with his son. What he did with his son, that he brought him and he made him love incarnate among us. That's what he wants to do with us. He wants us to be that love that every time they look at Matt and they look at Gilbert and they look at Carlos and they look at Hilda, that they look at the love of the Father here on earth, holding back brokenness, holding back generational curses, holding back all that stuff, because you and I enter a room and it changes the atmosphere because the love of Christ fills this place. But not only does it hold back, it reaches out. It reaches out and says, hey, you were messed up, but so was I. Come on in. My Papa's been waiting. Daddy's been waiting for us. Daddy's been waiting. I'm holding back, but I'm inviting in. I'm holding back, but I'm inviting in. You see, we forget sometimes that when we walk in our flesh wants to accuse and say, you did it, and you hurt me, and you broke me. That's what my flesh wants to do. My flesh wants to push people away and say, you don't deserve the love of God. You don't deserve forgiveness. You don't deserve all of that. That's what my flesh says. But through Jesus, he says, hold it back. Hold it back. And invite others in. This week, wherever you go, I want you to know when you walk in the room, you're holding back and you're inviting others in. Because you are like your Father. You're like your Father. And your father and your brother, we're in the family business. We're not kind of family, we are family. And the family business says this is our business. The perpetuation of sin, we hold it back. When we walk in the room, it changes the atmosphere because love walks in the room. Our Father walks in the room. In our flesh, we cannot. But through the Son, we can. Through the Son. Through the Son. You stand with me this morning. As our sister leads the song, we do something at the end of every service, and that is this. I want you to ask God, what are you speaking to me, God? What are you telling me to do, and what am I going to do about it? It's not good just to be a hearer of the word, but God calls us to be doers of the word. Maybe there's somebody God's put in your heart, and He's saying, you got to forgive them. You got to love them the way that I love them. You got to walk into a place that maybe has been uncomfortable for you, and you're like, I don't want to forgive them. You're going to tell them, God may be telling you, you can't do it on your own, but let me heal your heart and love them through me. This morning is not accident or chance. It isn't a coincidence. It isn't a coinky-dink that you showed up here today. God had a plan for you and His word in your life today. You're here because it's a divine appointment. My question to you is, you're just going to hear the word, or are you going to respond? You're going to say, God, I'm going to hear you and I'm going to obey you today.